Got it. Well, good afternoon, everyone. Today, I would like to present a conversation, a talk on what's happening politically in the Republic of Belarus right now, and put it in the context of so-called color revolutions. On this title screen, you can see Svetlana Tikhanovskaya, who is emerged as the major figure of political opposition in Belarus during the last year, from a person who was actually a housewife and who dedicated her life to raising children and supporting her husband's political ambitions. When he was arrested, she decided to take his place and just came out very strongly and became extremely popular out of the 6 presidential candidates during the election campaign of August 2020. She became the most popular, finally, really threatening Lukashenko's strong hold on the political control of elections, because for decades we've been watching Lukashenko's, absolutely repressing any political opposition, to such an extent that people who were watching what political events happening in Ukraine, Georgia, even in Central Asian Republic of Kyrgyzstan, people got this an outsider impression that Belarusian citizens were politically inert and passive. People usually had even joked about how Belarusians are so mild-spirited that when they wanted to protest some policies that they didn't agree with, they would go to the main square in Minsk and they would start applauding. And people said, look, these are such peaceful people. I mean, they really want to do everything very peacefully. Not this time, it still was on the behalf of political opposition. It was a peaceful protest movement, but there was a very violent suppression of the peaceful marches and demonstrations. And I'll talk about all of this a little bit later in more detail. So when I teach geography of the former Soviet Union, the 3 countries, we consider them together and look at them not just because they're neighbors, but because they shared so much of this Soviet common history. It is represented by Ukraine, the largest in population country of the Western tier countries, Belarus here, smaller country, and then really tiny country of Moldova. And the reason I want to emphasize this term, the Western tier countries, because it's a more respectful approach, because for a while in 1990s, especially the Russian geographers and political scientists called these countries the near abroad, kind of giving them automatically the second status, second citizen status. There is a real abroad, there are real geopolitical players, and then there is just this former Soviet Union republics like Belarus and Ukraine and Moldova, and so on. But of course, I would argue today that events of 2004 in Ukraine with Orange Revolution actually signified the end of such era, the early post-Soviet geopolitical era. And I will explain why. So here we're looking at the so-called Western tier countries. Here's our country, Belarus, much larger in area Ukraine, and this tiny landlocked, Belarus is also landlocked, I have to say, but Moldova is a really very small country. And here we have the territory of Ukraine is actually blocking it from the access to the Black Sea. And here you can see the flags of the former Soviet Union republics that now are independent states. So what is a color revolution? We often hear this term. What usually people in the West, people within the post-Soviet space themselves define. Usually we refer to the several political movements that took place between 2003 and 2005 in three former Soviet Union republics. It started with a Rose Revolution in Georgia, and then came Orange Revolution in Ukraine, and then Tulip Revolution in Kyrgyzstan. When you study the literature written on color revolutions, you can see that most of the authors agree that those processes were not maybe real full-blown revolutions like maybe October Revolution of 1917, or American Revolution, which is a radical transformation of society, and so on. But they were kind of phases in the transition of those societies, and those were the reactions to accumulated and perceived social, economic, political ills of the societies, electoral fraud and political corruption, a lack of freedom of expression, violation of human rights, economic mismanagement, and poverty. And Lincoln Mitchell, in his book on color revolutions, I think gives a very wonderful, very detailed analysis of these phases of transitional societies. Usually people start protesting when something, when big events in society happen. For instance, presidential elections or parliamentary elections, when people feel that the results were rigged, there was electoral fraud, and usually because they're already massively participating in this political process, electoral process, they're already mobilized. And so this is usually the time when the political opposition gathers all the efforts and people start demonstrating. And in all three cases, we saw that in Georgia, Ukraine, and Kyrgyzstan. Kyrgyzstan is a little bit different story, and I explain why. So here, if you look at the location of our color revolutions, this is Ukraine. Of course, a year earlier, it was Rose Revolution. And in Kyrgyzstan, 2005, Tulip Revolution. Also, sometimes they're described as peaceful street protests that turned out to be much more massive political process and event. But literally, in Georgia, what surprised us all living in the post-Soviet space was that the demonstrators came to the Georgian parliament holding roses in their hands, and no one actually got hurt. And it was just a massive expression of dissatisfaction with the current incumbent President Shevardnadze, who was the remnants of the Soviet hierarchy. His nickname was Silver Fox because he was Minister of Foreign Relations under Gorbachev. Different leaders came and were gone, but he stayed in the upper echelons of power. And in fact, he was invited back to the to lead the country after several unstable governments of Georgia collapsed. But in 2004, this young politician, Mikhail Saakashvili, educated at the American University. He got his lawyer's degree, law degree from either Harvard or Yale. And of course, that caused immediately the Russian government reacted. It was an American backed process. They said, this is we can see the American arm in all of this. Yes, to be objective, there was, of course, promotion of more democratic movements. We know Soros Foundation supported that. James Baker expressed his own personal support for the new regime. And at first it started wonderfully because Saakashvili came, he said that we will fight for the territorial integrity for Georgia, we will return Abkhazia, South Ossetia, which of course hasn't happened. And in fact, the situation with those breakaway republics deteriorated altogether. But one of the things he did, he tried to make an honest effort to fight corruption. For instance, overnight he fired 3,000 police officers because they were taking bribes and, you know, violating the law and order. And so there was a kind of a impression of winds of change, you know, and winds that brought good change, and that finally a true democratic state led by Mikhail Saakashvili will be formed. Of course, all kinds of different things happen. It's a complicated story. I don't have time to go into that, but it started all very rosy, if I may say so. And then in Kyrgyzstan, even though they called it nicely tulip revolution, just like in Ukraine and Georgia, it was so peaceful. No one was hurt. No one was, you know, shooting at other people. But in Kyrgyzstan, even during the tulip revolution, there were violent clashes of demonstrators, opposition with the governmental forces. And then once in a while, they will be ousting their presidents, and it became each next 4 or 5 years became even more violent. For instance, in 2010, the opposition literally killed several high-ranking governmental officials. President Bakiyev fled the country. Interestingly, the first democratically elected president of Kyrgyzstan was the only one on all the post-Soviet space who was not a communist apparatchik. He was actually professor of physics. He was a dissident. And so he got his reputation just like Václav Havel in Czechoslovakia or Gamsa Khurdi in Georgia as being a dissident, as a political opponent of communist regime. But unfortunately, within just several years of his presidency, his government became incredibly corrupt to such an extent that people ousted him and elected Bakiyev, who again turned the country into the almost brought the country almost to the brink of the civil war, when northern Kyrgyzstan and southern Kyrgyzstan began to fight for political power, economic interests, for monies and subsidies from the central government and so on. So again, not the same story, you know. Situation in Kyrgyzstan is different. And one of the articles that I recently read on political process in Kyrgyzstan said, referred to Kyrgyzstan as the permanent revolution, because the protests, every 3-4 years, we hear that there is a new, you know, political protest in Bishkek, in Osh. And here we have a new wave. I can see the new faces. I see a lot of youth demonstrating. This one, the most recent one, where young people, you know, protest against governmental control of the internet communication and the contents of that communication. Here in Kyrgyz language, it says, "Söz erkinligi jarandın en çok kuralı." In English, our freedom of speech is the first line of defense. So it's obviously a very more advanced, more informed type of protest. It's still peaceful protest, but you can see how even during the quarantine condition, under the quarantine conditions, the youth have this political will. They have a desire to defend their freedom of speech and freedom of communication, which is a great sign. So it is a process indeed, not just some radical event that absolutely transforms a society overnight. So here's the just political map, excuse me, of Eastern Europe. Here we can see Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, Slovakia, Hungary, Romania. All these countries are now members of the European Union, fully embraced, the full-blown members of the European Union since 2004, also members of NATO. And that, of course, created absolutely new geopolitical situation in the 1990s, but especially some people, several authors referring to Orange Revolution, saying the end of the early post-Soviet era actually happened during Orange Revolution, when Ukraine declared its interest in being absolutely independent politically from Russia, from its communist past, and declared its desire to transition to a new democratic nation state. And remarkably, we were all watching Orange Revolution in Ukraine with admiration, because it was extremely peaceful. There was no violent clashes, and people protested against the rigged elections. And so the pro-Western democratic politicians then, represented by Yushchenko and Tymoshenko, came to power. Here's the Kuchma, who was really almost like an evil person. He was accused of ordering to kill opposition journalists. There were several criminal investigations against him, and he was this kind of a ugly reminder of the communist repressions. And so we all cheered Orange Revolution. We were happy that finally people have this power, that new democratic reforms will take place. And so Yushchenko becomes the freely democratically elected president of Ukraine, and Yulia Tymoshenko becomes the prime minister. Again, just like with the hopes of Rose Revolution in Georgia, things began to go down the hill, because Yushchenko, a very nice person, but was not a very strong ruler, especially when it came to economic reforms or legal reforms. So all the negotiations now, we can see it in the pictures of that time after 2004, whenever there are negotiations about the imports of Russian gas or meeting with the European Union leaders, it's always Yulia Tymoshenko. Even she, as a prime minister, had more political clout than Yushchenko. Ended up in prison for striking unfavorable gas supply deal with Russia. And they accused her of treason and put her in, she was sentenced to 7 years in prison and then released earlier because of her poor health. So yeah, so there also, things did not just go all nicely and upwards and forwards, but in fact, there was another political crisis. So how do the Russian political scientists look at Ukrainian political project? Grinin, in his work, Ukraine as an Unfinished Political Project, discusses the factors that contributed to this sporty history of nation building and independence. Well, it's hard to argue with the geographical situation, conditions being, sometimes Ukraine is called optimistically the gates to Europe, sometimes on the, for instance, several Polish politicians openly said Europe ends at the Polish border with Ukraine. Ukraine is not Europe, and so on. But being the country at the crossroads, historically really created a lot of trouble for Ukraine, for instance. Target of geopolitical struggles of more powerful neighbors, between two models of civilization. There was always more pro-Western, Western Ukraine that historically had ties with Lithuania and the Lithuanian-Polish Commonwealth. And there was more, pro-Russia and Eastern Ukraine. And that, of course, fragmentation, both territorial, ethnic, linguistic, historical identity-wise remains. And of course, that is manifested in the Donbass, Luhansk, and Donetsk self-declared breakaway republics. Weakness of ideology, rule of oligarchs, conflicting interest among the elite. It doesn't only apply to Ukraine. Someone could have put some other former Soviet Union republics there and say Russia is an unfinished political project, or Uzbekistan is an unfinished political project. Very few, except for the Baltic countries, of course, who had enormous support from Western neighbors, succeeded that beautifully. Kazakhstan is one of the exceptions. They got really lucky. They had really good leadership represented by Nazarbayev. I always tell my students different courses that I teach that really sometimes there's always this debate about the role of a personality in history. Well, the Kazakhstan leadership was strong, consistent, and of course it helped that they had enormous supplies of oil and gas, and they benefited from that. So here we have Yanukovych, who replaced Yushchenko, bitter rivals, Yushchenko representing pro-Western political platform, and Yanukovych absolutely subservient to the Kremlin, to such an extent that he, and here we, speaking of this slide, actually represents the territorial, political, ethno-linguistic fragmentation of Ukraine when Yushchenko and Yanukovych were rivals for the presidential position. Yanukovych, supported by the base, which is now, of course, Luhansk and Donetsk, this working class people who still voted for the Party of Regions, which mostly before that voted for communists and so on. And then more central and Western Ukrainian electorate that felt that Ukraine should move more towards Europe and away from the Russian influence. And when Yanukovych became president of Ukraine in 2010, he promised Ukrainian voters that they will move towards union with European Union. He even had a minister that was responsible for relationship with the European Union. And suddenly in November 2013, he canceled all the plans. Turns out the Russian government offered him, I don't remember exactly the sum, 16, 18 billion dollars of help. And he says, okay, we're not moving towards the European Union anymore. We are now back with Russia. And that actually triggered the first peaceful protests on Maidan, Незалежности, which in Ukrainian means Independence Square, this big, huge open space in the center of Kiev. And it was peaceful for several months until the snipers killed the 100 protesters who later became known as the 100 Angels of Euromaidan. Most importantly, the power again shifted. Yanukovych fled the country, lives somewhere near Moscow. There's a whole, people actually joke about this little, place near Moscow where exiled despots live, starting with Rakashi of infamous 1956 Hungarian uprising, who was married to a Soviet citizen and who fled Hungary for that little, town where they exiled despots live. But yeah, so he unexpectedly declines to sign this association agreement with the European Union. That European Union initiative was called the Eastern, what was it called? Eastern I will remember it in a second, but Moldova, Ukraine, Belarus, Georgia, Azerbaijan, and Armenia were on the list of the countries that would move through those agreements with close economic, political, cultural relationship with the European Union countries. Did not happen, and Euromaidan began. In February 2014, Polish philosopher Marcin Kroll said that Europeans were facing a serious political crisis, potentially fatal spiritual crisis. They stopped asking important metaphysical questions. For instance, where does evil come from? And they said that this European civilization needs metaphysics. And that is actually one of the biggest, perhaps, basic values that European civilization has. It's a strong reliance on philosophy, ethical philosophy. And Marcy Shore wrote in this article that Maidan was the return of metaphysics, thus implying that Ukraine was coming back into the European cradle of civilization, away from that, godless aberration of history, communist regime. So here, the author writes, it was a precarious moment of moral clarity, an impassioned protest against rule by gangsters, against what in Russian is called произвол, arbitrariness and tyranny. It united Russian speakers and Ukrainian speakers, workers and intellectuals, Ukrainians and Jews, parents and children, left and right. The Ukrainian historian Yaroslav Hrytsak described the Maidan as similar to Noah's Ark. It took two of every kind. For him, the wonder of the Euromaidan was the creation of a truly civic nation, the overcoming of preoccupations with identity in favor of thinking about values. And I think this is extremely important point, because people in Eastern Ukraine have their own identities, because they speak Russian language. They wanted to push for federalization of Ukrainian nation state, with Russian becoming official language, at least regionally. The Uniat, so-called Greek Catholic Western Ukrainians have their own religious identity. Their dialect of Western Ukrainian is quite different from that in Kiev even. But here, you are in favor of thinking about values. What are these new metaphysical values? And of course, the whole work of Immanuel Kant comes to mind in this connection. So aftermath of Euromaidan, of course, very, very tragic events happened. First of all, illegal annexation of Crimea by Russia in March of 2014. Donetsk and Luhansk, two regions, declared themselves independent republics because they didn't recognize the results of the elections. They didn't recognize the regime in Kiev. They called them all kinds of bad names, including the followers of Stepan Bandera, sympathizers with the Nazis, people who collaborated with the Nazi regime, and so on. A huge, massive refugee crisis occurred when people were leaving both republics, but also people coming from leaving those for Russia. All kinds of humanitarian crises occurred. And finally, of course, Germany, Russia, France, and Ukrainian representatives said in Minsk, and then in known as the Minsk Protocol, later moved on a Normandy format, but things have not changed. And the reality is the war, and it's not just a hybrid war, it's a war where there is constant shelling on both sides, where people are not safe in their houses, I mean civilian population. And one of the things that kind of worries me is that the uh, political people who are at power in Russia, they are pushing this idea of Ruski Mir, which from Russian is translated as the Russian world. What does it mean? It means actually that the Russian world should expand to any country where there is a large Russian ethnic and Russian-speaking minority. That really bothers such countries as Estonia and Latvia, where over 20% of the population are the Russian, either ethnic Russians or people who speak the Russian language. And people say, we are concerned, what if Russia says we will have to defend our citizens abroad? And the most recent statistics is that out of several million people who live in Donetsk and Luhansk regions, 500,000 got Russian passports. That alarms me, because when you have a passport of the Russian Federation, then this is a very legitimate, from the Kremlin point of view, excuse to come and defend the lives, the safety of your citizens from a military point of view. I really don't like that development. But that's my kind of personal, I look at this process worrying. President Zelensky recently visited the Ukrainian army positions in Donbass. He's the current president of Ukraine. They insist that they would like to continue the Normandy protocol and that they're looking for a diplomatic and non-military solution of the crisis. I don't know, not very hopeful. But from here on, I would like to move to Belarus, because the most current events politically are happening actually in Belarus, with all kinds of geopolitical events that include several European neighbors of Belarus. So here's Kiev, capital of Ukraine. Here's Belarus, capital of Minsk. Moldova, capital Chisinau. Here's Chisinau, Kiev, and Minsk. Just a few words about Belarus. I've seen that in the 90s, the international community used to call this country Belarusia. Now, in all the most recent publication, I see Belarus even without apostrophe. So Belarus as an official name, because it's a Republic of Belarus. So what we have now, sometimes people refer to Belarus as the last sultanate of Europe. Of course, it's criticizing the authoritarian regime of Alexander Lukashenko, him being a sultan, a patriarch. And that's why we'll see a lot of feminist reaction to his regime, as symbolized and by Svetlana Tikhanovskaya and her supporters. An incredible large proportion of protesters nowadays in Belarus are women, young women, women of all age, housewives, intellectuals, professionals, all coming into the streets wrapped in the white and red flags. So now we have, as I said, President Vladimir Zelensky, democratically elected current president of Ukraine. And in Moldova, nowadays, I was very, very impressed by the most recent elections when pro-Western President Maya Sandu was the elected president, and transition of power from the pro-Russian ex-president was quite smooth. I was actually quite impressed by that, process. So I always give my students an idea of the population, the size of the country, how many people live in the capital city. And we see that Ukraine is a population as large as Poland's, Kiev is a very beautiful, modern, just like Minsk, um, you know, Kiev, historical, of course, absolutely beautiful city. But when we look at the population of Belarus and Moldova, we see that they're very, very small countries in terms of population. And I also tell my students how useful the mere statistics can be. We just need to know how to read the statistics. Well, GNP per capita, we can see that Belarus, despite of that last sultanate of Europe, they're actually doing quite well. Their rate of urbanization reflects the rate of industrialization. In fact, in the Soviet Union, there were only 4 fully industrialized Union republics: Russia, Kazakhstan, Ukraine, and Belarus. Well, of course, the Baltic republics had their share of industrial development, obviously, but a lot of much poorer Union republics had agricultural-based economy. And Belarus rate of urbanization is higher than average of the European Union, where it's 75. In fact, it's larger than Russian, for instance, and we can see how much agricultural is economy of Moldova, with only 43% of population living in the cities. Another most immediate indicator of how things are in the country is the statistics on infant mortality. Belarus is on par with Finland and Norway. It's the lower than average for the European Union. Ukraine has, similar to Cuba and the United States and Russia, Moldova worse than the Soviet statistics of the time. So that tells you things are quite well with the health system, and so on and so forth. It's one thing that changes immediately. The infant mortality is one of the, as a geography professor, I always insist on, there are certain indicators. You can have incredibly high GNP per capita in Azerbaijan, and then when the money doesn't trickle to the population, you have infant mortality over 28. It tells me that not everyone is enjoying that average GNP per capita at all. So of course, statistics can actually hide a lot of disparity of income in the country. So, and of course, Belarus, you can see on this picture, suffered the incredible catastrophic consequences of Chernobyl disaster of 1986, because the winds on that fateful day were blowing to the north. And so you can see that the huge territory of Belarus was contaminated by radioactive contamination. And that, of course, set back this country's economy. 10% of its budget, of its GNP, is still spent on the cleaning up of the topsoils. And there are some areas where the scientists say the land will recover after 50,000 years, which in human terms, never. It's even 10,000 is like, whoa. So one of the things of ethno-linguistic situations in Belarus is different from all the rest of the former Soviet Union republics, because 70% of the people declared their first language Russian. Only 28% speak fluent Belarusian, know it, use it in everyday life or professional life. And then, of course, there is part of the population that speaks kind of a dialectal mixture of Russian and Belarusian. In fact, Lukashenko was always ridiculed for not knowing Belarusian. He doesn't speak fluent Belarusian. He sometimes tried to give speeches in his own native tongue, but never finished his speeches. And so there was a lot of ridicule because of that. So Belarusians make almost 44% of the country. And as I said, Russian is spoken by over 70% of the population. 50% of people practice Eastern Orthodoxy. There is a large Polish ethnic minority, and they're Roman Catholic, and then about 40% of people are non-religious. And here we have this huge territory of Belarus that is actually is the largest marshland in the world, that historically prevented this country from Mongol invasion, because the horse riders will just drown there. The very successful guerrilla war, partisan war, was carried out by Belarusian partisans during the Second World War. Because of the heroic past, there is a huge, one of the biggest values and identities that merged into one for the Belarusian people is the sacrifice during the Second World War. Some of the most beautiful war novels and stories that I read, written by Belarusian authors, was dedicated to the heroic deeds of regular people, villagers, saving Jewish families, helping the partisans. And then their villages were all burnt and everyone was killed, you know. And so every fourth Belarusian actually died during the Second World War. And as a result of that, when the United Nations was founded, Ukraine, Russia, and Belarus were given separate independent votes at the United Nations in recognition of their incredible sacrifice during the Second World War. Minsk was always known as the exemplary socialist city, extremely comfortable to live, crime-free. I mean, there were always legends. People said, if you want to look comfortable, live comfortably in the Soviet Union, you need to, you know, move to Minsk, because the apartments are built beautifully, it's mild climate. And for a while, as an kind of almost like an inertia, living in this quasi-socialist state, when Lukashenko declared himself the father of the nation, Batka, where people could receive their pensions and salaries on time, where the rest of the former Soviet Union didn't see money for half a year. There were major strikes, for instance, in Siberian mining towns, where people were just thrown out of their enterprises into the streets without any money. And people tied themselves, for instance, some Siberian cities, we saw the strikes when people were tying themselves to the rails of the Trans-Siberian Railroad, ready to die, because there was no exit, there was no hope. And Lukashenko always said, look how exemplary is Belarus, how nicely. Yes, we have lower salaries, but we have socialist style crisis. Everyone is happy. And so that he perpetuated that, and his government, that myth for a while. And this is the, of course, the monuments to the heroic defenders of Belarus during the Second World War. Agriculture, the terrain of Belarus is not so rich. Soil is poor, so they don't have much agricultural economy. So during the Soviet times, they wisely invested into technology, you know, industrial enterprises. Some of the best heavy trucks and tractors were produced in Minsk. So here's Alexander Lukashenko, who portrayed himself as Batka, which in Belarusian means the father figure. So, and again, it lasted for a while. Each time there were elections, he always claimed that he won with over 80% of all the votes. And people knew that it was not true, too good to be true. But finally, last August, there were six very strong candidates, and one of them was Svetlana Tikhanovskaya. As I said, she was a housewife, though she is has a university diploma as an English teacher and interpreter, and took place of her husband, who was arrested. And that is one of the biggest sins of Lukashenko's regime, that they have political prisoners. And that was one of the agendas on Tikhanovskaya's party platform. They want to return to Constitution of 1994 that Lukashenko changed to make his own regime and ruling more comfortable. They demanded freeing political prisons, to move away from Union Treaty with Russia, because they wanted, like Ukraine, to become more sovereign, more independent, and not depend so much on Moscow's decision. Guaranteeing human rights. A lot of feminist issues were raised as well. And all the methods were peaceful. Peaceful marches and demonstrations, strikes, which was the most painful for Lukashenko, because most of his electorate were proletariat, workers. And when they threatened to go on strike, that's when he felt that things might be over for him. It were those the liberal intellectual professors, students. When the workers of Minsk tractor plant said, we are not going to tolerate violence against peaceful demonstrations, that was a huge blow. That's when he ran to Moscow, to Sochi, I believe, and was absolutely out of his mind, scared. People use the historical white, red, and white flag that has this historical Slavic warrior on horse as opposition to the flag that is actually modified from the Soviet times flag. It goes back to 1918, when it was not first, but maybe most widely used in 1918, when the first Republic of Belarus was formed after the revolution. Unfortunately, during the Second World War, that flag was seen flying next to the Nazis' flag. And so there was some kind of, so it is a tainted symbol. But this time they protested, people want a symbol when they go on peaceful demonstrations. This time for the Belarusian people, it became the historical flag with this ancient kind of Belarusian warrior defending their nation, to get away from the Soviet symbolism and from the flag that is always behind Lukashenko, because he's the father of the nation. So I think it is important to understand that. And here we see that the governmental forces were actually pushing the peaceful demonstrators too much. And there was a lot of women. I was very impressed with that particular fact. There was an extremely active participation of women and youth. And here they're using, this is actually quite humorous, this new card, Trump's an ace, where they have the image of Svetlana Tikhanovskaya saying, because he's always like, I'm a father of the nation, we need to live like, we should keep our ancient tradition when the father is the head of the family, the whole thing, this patriarchal society, paternalistic society. And this was a clear protest. That's why so many women, I think, backed the figure, leader of Svetlana Tikhanovskaya, finally tired of that living in a sultanate. Yeah, and he's been in power since 1994. I mean, people don't live that long. But anyways, here he's running to Sochi, September 2020, the events of August, when, 3 days in Minsk. Minsk was absolutely chaotic from his point of view. And he's just absolutely outraged. And we can see like Putin, I really don't know if I'm going to support you yet. He still has not really firmly backed him, like openly. But Lukashenko has visited Russia since that September meeting in Sochi several times. And he calls Putin all the time, like, what I'm gonna do? What I was like literally in panic. And I think that the biggest blow when workers of Minsk tractor plant, who were used to be his base of electorate, these are the people who usually voted for him, because it's like, yeah, because they had maybe socialist ideology, they felt that they were safe. But here they say in these posters, we're not sheep, we're not cattle, we're not little people, we are workers of Minsk tractor plant. And then there are not 20 of us, there are 16,000 of us. Meaning that we're not just, this kind of independent bloggers sitting there in our apartments protesting against the regime. This is a real, incredibly important transformation. This really feels like a real revolution, when the proletariat takes to the streets. Oh my goodness, when the when there's a strike, the plants stop working. Wow, that was quite powerful. And so what we have now then, one of the young protesters, Roman Protasevich, was on a plane flight from Athens to Vilnius, which of course the Lithuanian government supports. Tikhanovskaya now lives in exile in Lithuania. And then there was a false alarm that there's a bomb on the plane. And so the Ryanair was accompanied by a military plane and forced to land in Minsk. And there was of course, an outrage, international, condemning of that. And as a result, the European Union suspended all the flights over, Belarus. And then Russia did not say anything directly, but suspended 2 flights recently coming from France to Russia, to Moscow, because they refused to fly over Belarus. So we see this absolutely different geopolitical situation now. So we'll always speak about hybrid war, but here we have this really dangerous situation when the planes, stop flying over certain territories, when Russia says, Air France, you cannot land in Moscow. This is serious. And so we should, really analyze carefully what's happening right now in this geopolitical space. He's a young guy, founder of internet site of political blogging, protesting called Nechta. And he's only 26 years old. He was the reason why they landed that plane, arrested him. Now he's giving interviews saying that he is guilty of being part of the extremist terrorist organization, that he stirred up the crowds. The foreign journalists say that he has signs of like violence, maybe bruises. It's really, really very, very becoming very ugly. He's obviously very shaken when he was given that interview. Yeah, there's a young person who said, yeah, I coordinated all these actions with Svetlana Tikhanovskaya's headquarters. I'm guilty. And he is afraid that because he was a part of Azov special forces in Donbass, Lukashenko says, if you don't agree to give this interview, I'll send you to Donbass, where they will shoot you to death. The guy is absolutely terrified. In fact, when they were landing in Minsk, he said, I'm afraid that they will actually give me not life sentence, but they would just say that I'm guilty of treason. And just to sum it up, Western actions against Belarus are not the new thing. They just began in 2005, 2006, when there were, political prisoners. There was a scandal with that. But the new sanctions from the European Union involve, banning of certain imports from Belarus, including the potash Belarus has 20% of the world reserves. And this is industrialized economy. And at least 88 persons and companies are now on the list of, that are banned from working with the European Union countries. Biden administration on Friday said, Psaki said, the press secretary said that they're preparing a list of sanctions, and they formulated in this way. The Lukashenko's government is associated with ongoing abuse of human rights and corruption, the falsification of the 2020 elections, and the events of May 23, meaning the forced landing of the Ryanair flight. And I just want to say a few words at the end. Of course, could have put a lot of sources here, but I think if you're interested in this topic, I would recommend Competitive Authoritarianism, Hybrid Regimes After the Cold War. And this is actually a huge book because the authors looked at 35 countries in different parts of the world, Latin America, Africa, East Europe. It reads like encyclopedia. I found it useful. Lincoln Mitchell's book on color revolutions, where he discusses these three first revolutions. Another book that I find interesting is Democratization by Elections, a New Mode of Transition. Because as I try to show today, a lot of major shifts in political system occur during decisive moments when people are mobilized to go and vote. Between the elections, people maybe go around doing their own routine stuff. But when there is like, who is going to be next president of Russia? Or will Lukashenko finally go away? A lot of people get, mobilized, and this is important. And so I think that book actually speaks to that point. Andrew Wilson's book, this is a new edition. He already wrote History of Belarus, but promptly in March of 2021, he issued this new edition, Belarus, the Last European Dictatorship, where he also analyzes very cleverly the situation in Belarus. And the last book I would recommend is Ukraine Over the Edge, Russia, the West, and the New Cold War. Because again, we cannot understand what's happening in Belarus without looking at the Ukrainian context and what was happening since, collapse of the Soviet Union in this post-Soviet republics like Georgia, Ukraine, Kyrgyzstan, and Ukraine, Belarus. Thank you very much. I hope that was interesting.